Some people fear the certainty of death and the eternity of non-existence that follows, while others fear the opposite, everlasting life with no respite or closure to existence. Both of these fears, at least partially, involve the incomprehensible nature of the concept of infinity itself. Apeirophobia is the dread of infinity, or the infinite, often connected to thanatophobia, which is the fear of death. Apeirophobia involves the mind's inability to grapple with the concept of the infinite, an endless expanse of time, space, or existence that defies quantification or understanding. When considering something lasting forever, the comforting words of Sufi poets, "This too shall pass," hold no sway. Apeirophobia can be triggered by contemplating the vastness of the universe, the never-ending passage of time, or the relentless cycle of life and death. Our inability to reconcile with the idea of something that extends endlessly can lead to anxiety and distress. Apeirophobia is perhaps unique amongst phobias. Most phobias are irrational fears of something, but apeirophobia is a fear of something that is itself irrational. Before we go further, let's first explore the concept of infinity itself. The ancient Greeks had a rocky relationship with infinity. Their gods were immortal, although these gods' existences had starting points. And their mythology contained plenty of accounts of infinite punishment, or eternal torments, for certain wrongdoers. Prometheus, the god who was punished for giving fire to humans, was chained to a rock where an eagle would eat his liver, only to have it grow back, after which the eagle would return and eat it again, only to have it grow back, and so on, for eternity. Sisyphus was a Corinth king who was punished with the hard labor of pushing a large boulder up a hill, after which it would roll back down, and Sisyphus would have to push it back to the summit, after which it would roll back down, etc. Tantalus, king of Lydia, was punished with eternal hunger and thirst, with water and food eternally just out of his reach. Presocratic philosopher Anaximander was the first Greek thinker to give significant consideration of an infinite universe. Anaximander used the word apeiron to describe the infinite nature of the cosmos. Apeiron literally means unbounded, and Anaximander saw this indeterminate or unboundedness as the essence of the universe. A few hundred years later, Greek philosopher Aristotle denied the possibility of an infinite universe, positing that the earth is the center of all things, and an infinite universe would have no center. Before Aristotle, another pre-Socratic thinker, Zeno of Elea, while trying to prove that everything is one eternal entity, with divisibility and plurality being illusions, used the concept of infinity to showcase the absurdity of movement and change. For example, Zeno argued that if a man were to run a certain distance, he would first have to run half that distance, and before running half the distance, he would have to run half of the half distance. But before running half of the half distance, he would have to run half of this new half distance, and so on for infinity. Therefore, he would have to run an infinite amount of half distances before reaching any finite distance. Since it is impossible to run an infinite amount of distances in a finite amount of time, Zeno concluded that motion itself must not exist. Aristotle, in response to Zeno, distinguished between what he called actual infinity and potential infinity. Potential infinity is an abstraction, where one could conceptually add or subtract indefinitely, whereas actual infinity is the real adding or subtracting and the completion of such an infinite regression or progression. Aristotle did not believe that a potential infinity could become an actual infinity. In the case of the man running to a certain point, there is the potential infinite half-distances between the starting and ending point, but there is no actual infinite division of half-distances. Actual infinity was too irrational, or incomprehensible, for Aristotle to accept. Also, Aristotle in his treatises Physics and Metaphysics discussed the impossibility of infinite causality. While considering the change and flux that we observe around us, he deduced that that change or movement must have a cause, and that cause must have a cause, and so on. However, it would be impossible for this chain of causality to go on forever, so there must be a first cause. He called this first cause the unmoved mover. This unmoved mover must be eternal, completely independent, and unchanging. He states, "For it is impossible that there should be an infinite series of movements, each of which is itself moved by something else, since in an infinite series there is no first term. If then everything that is in motion is moved by something, and the first movement is moved but not by anything else, it must be moved by itself." Again, an infinite regress was not acceptable to Aristotle. Late antiquity thinker St. Augustine, in his Confessions, when asked what God was doing during the time before he created the universe, which would have been an infinite amount of time, replied that there was no time until God created it. God created time as part of the universe, and before its creation, time did not exist, so there was no before. Augustine stated, "But if before heaven and earth there was no time, why is it asked, 'What did you do then?' For there was no then when time was not." Likewise, 800 years later, Thomas Aquinas stated, "And so it is that Holy Scripture proclaims the creation of things to have been effected in an indivisible instant. For it is written, 'In the beginning God created heaven and earth.' This beginning is the beginning of time." God, according to Aquinas, was not eternal, because eternity is the infinite progression of time, and God, as the creator of time, is outside of time. In other words, God is not eternal, he is atemporal. Erasing God from the equation, a similar answer could be given centuries later to the question, "What was there before the Big Bang?" To which one could reply, "Time and space are products of the Big Bang, so there was no before the Big Bang." One might choose to see these considerations as a clarification of the problem of infinite regression or progression, similar to those explored by Aristotle. Early 17th century French philosopher René Descartes discussed infinity in relation to the mind-body duality problem. In his Meditations on First Philosophy, Descartes asserted that our bodies and senses are clearly finite, but curiously our minds possess the idea or concept of an infinite and perfect God. He argues that this idea could not have come from our finite experience of the world, but rather must have come from the mind itself as a clear and distinct idea. The ability of the mind to conceive of an infinite immaterial substance, that is, God, while being finite, could only have happened if this concept came from an infinite God itself, or so Descartes argues. According to Dr. Sophie Berman, researcher and department chair of philosophy and religious studies at St. Francis College, to Descartes the mind discovers itself as an infinite power of self-assertion, a subjectivity, positing itself from within. But the mind also knows that it is finite, and receives its being from an other, the infinite substance, or God, of which it finds within itself the idea, as one which cannot be derived from its idea of itself. The Cartesian conception of subjectivity is openness to the infinite. Descartes struggled to describe how an immaterial mind, with infinite capacity and the mark of the infinite creator, could interact and influence the finite material substance of our body. Dutch thinker Spinoza, in response to the problem of the immaterial interacting with the material, or the infinite interacting with the finite, harking back in some ways to Zeno and his teacher Parmenides, denied the existence of any finite substances and concluded that there is only one eternal and infinite substance, and everything in the universe, whether it be a person, a flea, a galaxy, a thought or a feeling, are modes or expressions of this eternal substance. These modes, that is, anything and everything, are eternal and infinite and exist necessarily. German polymath Gottfried Leibniz, similarly to Spinoza's argument for modality, in his book Monadology, argued that everything is composed of indivisible soul-like monads, which contain an infinite amount of potential manifestations, only a handful of which actually manifest. British empiricist philosopher John Locke, who believed knowledge has ultimate value only when it can be traced back to an immediate sense perception, partially in response to the metaphysical and fanciful conclusions of Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, concluded that the idea of infinite space is simply the mind's taking perceptions of finite space and expanding them theoretically. which gives rise to the imagined idea of an infinite space. David Hume, another British empiricist who was skeptical of metaphysical claims, applied this same principle to the idea of an infinite God. He stated in his Enquiry concerning human understanding that the idea of God, as meaning an infinite being, arises from reflecting on the operations of our own mind, and augmenting without limit those qualities. We may prosecute this Enquiry to what length we please, where we shall always find that every idea which we examine is copied from a similar impression. To Hume, the same concept applies to our ideas of an infinite progression of time or space. Drawing conclusions about infinity, which is a quantity we cannot actually perceive, to Hume was a fruitless task. In his Critique of Pure Reason, largely inspired by Hume's writing, German philosopher Immanuel Kant posited that time, like causality and the unity of the self, is a concept that we bring to the world and our experience of it. To Kant, time is a principle that we apply to the change and flux that we perceive around us. It is impossible for us to imagine things existing without placing them in this time framework. Something either was, is, or will be, or else it is not something at all. For this reason, he thought time was a priori or necessarily true. Like Hume, he was skeptical about the idea of infinity, since we cannot perceive it, but nonetheless Kant thought that infinity was a quality of space and time. Oxford professor of philosophy Adrian William Moore states that, to Kant, infinity is written into the form of whatever we experience, that there can also be experience of how things are further out, further in, earlier or later. These, on Kant's view, were mathematical truths, a priori and unassailable. But there is a question about how the topology of space and time can be a priori. Kant's celebrated reply was that space and time are not features of things in themselves. They are part of an a priori framework which we contribute to our experience of things. This opens the door to the idea that time itself may be an illusionary concept or filter through which we experience the world, although Kant himself did not believe this. If time is itself an illusion, then an infinite progression of time would also be an illusion. Furthermore, it may be that the idea of an infinite expanse of space is also an illusion created by our perceptions, or the mind's framing of its sensations of the world. In more recent times, Einstein claimed that he did not believe that space is infinite. And some physicists, say British scientist Julian Barbour, in his book The End of Time, believes that the flow of time itself is an illusion, which would imply that time does not proceed forward infinitely, since it does not proceed forward at all. This is just the tip of the iceberg of influential thinkers' ideas around the concept of infinity. For one, there is the whole mathematical field's treatment of infinity, including the works of Dedekind, Cantor, Frege, Russell, Gödel and more. However, we will not be discussing any of that here, mostly because it is way over my head. Still, the limited aforementioned ideas around infinity may help us contextualize apeirophobia and explore possible ways to cope with this fear of the infinite. In a September 1, 2006 article for The Atlantic, science writer Bobby Azarian wrote an article on apeirophobia, which he begins by telling the story of his grandfather passing away when he was 4 years old. His family comforted him by telling him his grandfather was in a beautiful, calm and happy place, where he would be united with all his loved ones, forever and ever. Rather than comforting him, lying in bed that night, trying to conceptualize the idea of forever and ever caused him great distress. Looking at Reddit and other sites online where those who suffer from apeirophobia discuss their fear, hearing about heaven or the afterlife as a child is a common catalyst for apeirophobia. Many on these sites describe panic attacks, crippling anxiety, and even thoughts of suicide when contemplating infinity. Unfortunately, there is not much psychiatric literature on apeirophobia or the treatment of this phobia. The site Practical Psychology has an article published in 2023 that discusses the phobia in general terms and says that consulting a mental health professional, reflecting on eternity coupled with breathing techniques, or getting prescribed anti-anxiety medication may help. Other sources claim that mindfulness may help with the anxiety associated with apeirophobia. Cognitive therapy and exposure therapy are techniques used to treat phobias, where one gradually increases one's exposure to the object of one's fears and then uses cognitive tools to lessen that fear. This makes sense when the fear is of something concrete, where the innocuous nature of the object gradually becomes clearer the more one is exposed to it. But how does one expose oneself to the infinite, and how would such an exposure even help? Some suggest those that suffer from apeirophobia learn to find beauty in the infinite, or just to try and not think of it at all. Perhaps understanding the phobia itself might cognitively help. One of the root issues seems to be that our finite minds just cannot comprehend something infinite. It is completely fruitless to even try to comprehend, and therefore pointless, in a sense, to be afraid of it. For why fear something before we even know what it is? Furthermore, as suggested earlier in this video, perhaps time and infinity, and eternal space, are not even real at all. Some physicists believe that space is actually finite, and that time, and therefore infinite time, is an illusion. And perhaps one can find solace in this possibility. If infinity is an illusion, then there is nothing there to be afraid of. We can perhaps apply this same concept to a religious perspective, and the fear of an infinite afterlife. If God, as the creator of time and space, is in some sense separate from time and space, and if the afterlife is in some sense a union with God, then it could be that the afterlife is not an infinite existence, but rather an atemporal one, which, since we can only conceptualize things temporally, is an existence outside the realm of understanding, but at least it is not an infinite one.